I think in India what happens is that we are sort of caught in two extremes. There's either advanced in macroeconomics, there are advanced economy concepts, what is relevant for a advanced economy, for a mature economy, or there's a history of underdevelopment, poverty, traps, and the intellectual ball sort of tosses between these two. But transition requires something very different. Also, it's possible that decades of underperformance led to an entrenched pessimism among intellectuals. And the majority of economists, for example, studied underdevelopment. So if you study underdevelopment, you are very reluctant to see or not able perhaps to see development taking place and how things are changing. I came across this a lot, and also ideological issues. Thought is trapped in ideology rather than perceiving the reality. Markets are booming. Markets are priced in all these prospects, and the stock markets have really been booming. But the strange thing is that actual growth in India has remained subdued, below potential, ever since 2011. There's excess capacity in industry, slow employment growth. This is a very long time to underperform. So is there an element of self-fulfilling pessimism in this, especially among policymakers, in the kind of, the facilitation environment that is there for industry? This period has coincided with tight monetary policy, the adoption of inflation targeting since 2014, and fiscal consolidation. So I'm going to argue that there are perhaps, we can classify, just for the purpose of debate, classify monetary policies into type 1, which has a pessimistic view of possibilities. You say you're supply constrained, there are bottlenecks, and you cannot grow until you have structural reforms. Demand, for example, will just lead to inflation. And there is type 2, which I will argue is more suited to transition, where, especially in a populous country like India, one feature of transition is that underutilized factors begin to be used more productively. So there can be persistent growth effects of short-run macroeconomic policy also. Neat segregation between supply factors driving growth and demand, which affects just cycles, is not possible. So this classification shares aspects of traditional classification, where type 1 could also be sort of linked to monetarist views, or the view from capital, which wants more conservative policies, low inflation, low fiscal deficit, while type 2 is more Keynesian and takes the view of labor, increasing employment, respond to unemployment. But I think this is different from these standard classifications because it can also, we'll try to bring in structural emerging market features that are normally missing. And one such feature is that of self-fulfilling expectations, linked to this pessimism versus optimism view. Macroeconomics talks about animal spirits that drive investment. So are these animal spirits being unleashed, or are they quelled? And discussing this is important in the Indian context, where we've seen investment growth become negative. And moreover, it also resonates with the Indian cultural concept of sankalp, the idea that an idea must come before its execution. Any type of creation must first be seen as possible. But this is not to deny reality or the necessity of hard work and improved systems for success. And to be fair, moreover, Indian policy has been fighting inflation that rose into double digits in 2008, and it persisted high for long. So doesn't high inflation point to demand exceeding supply and therefore requiring macroeconomic stabilization, monetary tightening, and fiscal consolidation? What we've seen over the past few years past decades of higher growth and development is that the share of agriculture has really come down. It accounts for only 16% of output now. And it's, moreover, the reason for this dual economies or separate treatment of agriculture and industry and macro concentrating on industry was that you could think of agricultural output as fixed in the short run, so that demand would create inflation in agriculture. But now you're a more open economy. And so what you have is that you can import agricultural goods. So you don't have that quantity restriction. So what is important then is the exchange rate, because even a political economy of price fixing, and if you have imports, and even though they're at the margin, they affect your prices. Yeah? So now, this, instead of a dual economy, you can think of these agriculture-industry interactions as affecting the cost of production, and therefore that aggregate supply curve. So this, now when you think of the way macroeconomics is done in advanced economies, then this kind of apparatus, normally you talk about, this is price setting by firms, and what is relevant is the marginal cost of firms. As employment rises, you're reaching full employment, and marginal cost of hiring more workers is going to rise. So the aggregate supply becomes upward sloping. So you have a kink until you have excess capacity. So they don't think of an aggregate supply shifting upwards. So what I'm arguing, again, what is different in the Indian feature is that these kind of cost shocks affect average cost. It's not just at the margin. If the cost, your wages are going up, or inflation expectations are going up because food price inflation is very high, and that affects the consumer basket, then it's going to affect your cost of production at every level of output, right? So you need to think of it as affecting the average cost of a firm, not the marginal cost, and therefore shifting up that supply curve. And why is it flat? The reason is that the ultimate factor of production is labor. And in India, you have large amounts, although our unemployment statistics might show low, but if you look at skilled or youth unemployment, it's very, very high. And you're seeing a lot of migration from rural to urban areas. And rural-urban shifts, as well as a lot of entrance of young people. Because of one figure we hear is 12 million new entrants every year. All these people need to have jobs. So if you have low employment growth, it's a serious problem politically also. But the point is that you can increase output without really raising marginal costs for the firm. So it is flat. Sometimes people say there's a shortage of skills. But the other thing about development and transition, again, is that you have what I call quality ladders. You have different types of jobs that become available. You normally say services or informal sector, very low productivity. But you have new types of informal sector, using the internet and entrepreneurship, where you can have very high productivity, and these are sort of skilled people who are active there. So again, it is costs can be actually lower than they are perceived sometimes, because these new aspects of the economy are not measured very well sometimes. So among the important shift factors are, because still, although agriculture accounts for 15% of output, food products account for 60% of the consumption basket. So they're very important for wages and so on. Wages, inflation expectations, then because of the open economy, exchange rate and depreciation will affect food prices. And the high growth, the high inflation episode we had from 2008 was really started with very high international food prices. Then what is also important is the composition of government expenditure, because more investment which reduces infrastructure constraints, lowers costs of doing business, etc., would again be one of the factors that shifts this supply curve. And generally, some research shows that the investment multiplier is much higher and more persistent, because it affects the supply side compared to consumption multiplier. It also reduces the current account deficit. A recent paper I did with a student, we found this over the longer term. So, and the other factor that affects this aggregate supply is governance. In general, poor governance increases costs. So then we come, now these are the macroeconomic arguments for this type 2 monetary policy. Because what this framework suggests is that you focus on policies that shift down aggregate supply, whether it's monetary or fiscal. Monetary would be preventing too much exchange rate depreciation, affecting inflation expectations. Sometimes people tell me that if there's no role for monetary policy. They say monetary policy is only reducing aggregate demand. But if you're inflation targeting, I argue that the most important channel of transmission is really to anchor inflation expectations. Yeah? And that affects expected wages and actual wages, and therefore shift factors that affect the aggregate supply curve. one of the puzzles in India, in a democracy, we have very vibrant democracy that has survived, although internationally India was expected to collapse soon after independence. Illiterate voters and heterogeneous voters and castes and so on. But one of the puzzles is that we have very complete and persistent political inclusion, but not economic inclusion. We still have a lot of poor, a lot of illiterate, low skills. So how did this happen? Because ultimately in a democracy, policy follows what brings in votes. So the problem was that the illiteracy meant and the heterogeneity cast that politicians could focus on vote banks. But now with more education, awareness, this is changing. And so you are seeing that governance is paying even politically. We are seeing this again and again in state elections and in the center. Voters are demanding better public services, health, education, all of which can lead to economic inclusion. And we're seeing the government undertaking structural reforms, improving infrastructure, ease of doing business. One of the factors, we have a lot of small and micro industries where they are not able to get credit and because they don't have documentation or they don't follow standards. So all these, as they improve, and they can become part of the more formal economy. So GST will be an important reform in improving this documentation and bringing in a lot of small and informal firms into the formal economy. Then development of human capacity, health, education, better environment, all this. So, in the literature, you distinguish between what is called narrow versus broad or active inclusion. While the first just reduces inequality and was the focus of the socialist kind of policies that we followed earlier, redistribution. The second gives broad rights, voice, and capabilities and makes the excluded active participants. And that is suited to our youthful demographics. Also, a lot of the productivity growth in an economy today comes from innovation. And some research I've done suggests that pure income transfers need not shift the poor to dynamic technologies that show continuous improvement, while active inclusion can do this. And it can also induce more innovation in accessible technologies as their market size increases. So that suggests one of the debates in India is that will we follow the China model, low skill, we need export-oriented industry, which is what is going to create employment. But that might not be feasible in today's world where the advanced economies are shrinking and there are various constraints put on trade. So can India have more of a services rather than a manufacturing-led kind of growth? And even for manufacturing, innovation suggests that you're moving where it will help to be situated for, you'll have the 3D printer and, it'll help to be near your market. So it might be that FDI will come in, but they will produce for a vibrant Indian market where jobs are created through this quality ladder as people move up. The earlier maids who were paid very poorly will now shift to internet, kind of housekeeping services, which offer more professional services and are more highly paid. So you have productivity improving in that way. The new data has been coming out, which shows that pessimistic view. We had our GDP series revised, GDP value added, and it showed higher growth. And there was a cottage industry of economists saying this data is incorrect, there's some problem with this, it's not reliable, we can't be growing at those rates, etc., etc. And recently we've had what they were doing was shifting to a much larger base, a sample of industries using the MCA 21 database, 5 lakhs from the RBI sample of 3,000 industries. And so it shows the kind of industries, the vibrancy, the dynamism. Okay, people would criticize that most of these are dummy and shell industries meant to siphon off money and so on. But you needed to move. The economy is changing. You needed to capture a larger part of the economy in your data. So recently we've had the WPI revised. You're seeing that the new WPI is actually lower than the old. This graph, the old is the red lines and the blue is the new WPI. So you're seeing, as it is, WPI inflation was really low because of the fall in oil prices in 14. And the new WPI is showing, so inflation is actually much lower than we perceived it to be, and then policymakers were reacting to, right? And then similarly for IIP, you're seeing the new IIP, which captures a much larger basket and so on, and therefore is an improvement. The rates of growth are much higher in the new IIP. But that doesn't mean that we are at capacity or at potential output because we're growing faster. It just means that our capacity has gone up. We have many more industries now. And if you see in the recent period, even the blue line growth rates have been falling. So policies have reduced growth even according to the new IIP. You know, like there's an area in Bangalore called Koramangala, which is focusing on ICT businesses. So if you see this story in India, at the turn of the century, we started with Y2K. People talked about body shopping. It's just, you know, Indian engineers. Now you're moving towards value addition. So this quality ladders and many more opportunities is a feature of a growing, of transition, of an economy developing in many different directions, which are very often not measured properly. So then policymakers have to take data with a pinch of salt and have other ways of deciding on how they fix rates, right? And so we are talking about the fundamental factors that support a type 2 approach to policy. So another feature is just India's diversity. As an economy, it's so large. There's so many different states and different cultural aspects. People don't look the same when you travel to East Asia. Everybody looks so much the same when you come back to the Indian airport and you see. So we have a natural diversity, and diversity always encourages innovation. And then reforms have increased our economic diversity because you have an export sector which is developed, as well as industry, services, outsourcing. New sort of industries have developed. So if the fundamental reform and productivity improvements are happening, it suggests that in that first diagram, you can expect to see that costs reducing in the economy. The new WPI is showing lower inflation. Costs have been falling, lower than we actually thought they were. I often think, for example, I love on YouTube, you can just listen to classical music, any music that you like for free. There's so many things you're getting for free in today's economy. You price this in, and prices you're facing as consumers are much lower. So as long as costs are falling, that aggregate supply is shifting down, macroeconomic policy should support a rise in demand. So our policymakers have adopted this inflation targeting framework with the output gap is very important. The idea of the output gap is you look at potential output, actual output minus capacity. And if you're approaching capacity, if it exceeds capacity, then it would be inflationary. And you know, the recent MPC, for example, said they see the output gap as closing soon. But the problem is that this is measured using time series methods largely, so that your capacity is determined, the endpoint has an extra weight. So if growth has been falling, now you say your capacity is low. And that seems absolutely not suited if you think of that aggregate demand-supply structure. Because if you have a flat aggregate supply capacity, there's no constraint really, as long as inflation is not rising. And moreover, you know that there is excess capacity in industry. A lot of RBI studies show that. You know that there is large, low productivity employment. All of it supports that flat aggregate supply. So but type 2 policy doesn't mean that you can just increase demand endlessly and that there is no role for monetary policy. There is a role, but the productive role would be if it anchors inflation expectations, shifts down that aggregate supply. So one of the powerful contributions of inflation targeting is just this in anchoring inflation expectations. But the way it has been interpreted, the way it has been used in the past couple of years where it has been implemented is to, typically you're supposed to raise your nominal interest rate if expected inflation is high so that your real interest rate is positive. In India in the past, we very often had cases where real interest rates were negative. Yeah? So inflation targeting does not allow that. But then your forecasts of inflation, which is the expected inflation communicated to the market, becomes very important. So the TAC, I looked at some data, the years over 2014-16 after inflation targeting was implemented and they announced an expected inflation path. This expected inflation path is always either flat or U-shaped. That means even if inflation today is falling, say oil prices fell in 2014, they would say we expect inflation to come up. This is temporary. And so since your expected inflation you're announcing is higher, that means you have to keep your nominal interest rate higher, right? And the other sad thing was that in most cases this was over-predicted. Actual inflation was much lower than the predicted. So there were two negative aspects of this. You were not anchoring household inflation expectations insofar as they take the RBI's forecasts as something they factor into their, you're saying you're expecting inflation to rise, and how do you expect household inflation expectations to fall? Yeah? And then you're keeping interest rates high. So you see this over this period, the different, the brown line, dark brown line is the repo rate. It was brought down up to 2014 slowly, but WPI really fell very steeply because of the oil price fall. And they were targeting the blue line, that is CPI headline now. And they followed the IMF had estimated that the natural interest rate in India, the interest rate which is consistent with the steady inflation and full capacity output, is in the range of 1.25 to 1.75. So they're using headline inflation, which is the most volatile, affected by food prices. The other feature of this period was food price inflation was higher than WPI. And so consumer prices inflation was much higher than producer price inflation, which is relevant for industry. So the real interest rate facing industry was very, very high. And therefore you can explain the continued industrial stagnation. But consumers and as savers, the money we are putting in banks was giving us a positive interest rate. But because of this incorrect inflation forecasts, this rate was probably even higher than this natural rate, which was, and the IMF gave this range in a period when internationally, for advanced economies, it was saying the natural rates are going to zero. Because after the global financial crisis, they face low demand and so on, and unemployment. While unemployment levels were much higher in emerging markets, and they're in a catch-up phase. So this is conservative and excessive predicted inflation, reduce the use of the expectations channel of inflation targeting, which is much more effective than squeezing aggregate demand or squeezing, increasing an already negative output cap. And current monetary policy communications again expect inflation to rise. And the reasons they give is that they see core inflation as persistent. Now, if you look at this graph, core inflation, WPI core, you see that core inflation, there were two. The red line is CPI core, which they say is persistent, the dashed red line. And this, they say, is persistent because of persistent high prices of services, education, medical services. But you see that there are two periods where it fell very sharply, in 2012 and again in 2014. So it's not true that it's persistent and that it will never fall. It's possible that it will fall. And we measure it tomorrow, we'll probably find it had fallen quite a bit and we didn't know it had fallen. So it's not correct that it's persistent. Then they see rural wages as rising. And again, I think policy authorities also see the past as repeating. They don't look forward. So in the past inflationary episode, you had very high rural wage growth. So you see rural wages are rising. Again, food price inflation is going to rise. But again, I have a paper where I show that they affect prices. Rural wages affect prices. Only food prices are in double digits, and then wage growth is really high. While a small 4-5% wage growth is required because productivity is improving that much, so, and can be absorbed without inflation. Then they see oil shocks as being temporary. If oil prices fall, it will be reversed. But we know that the oil economy has changed internationally, US shale oil and so on. Oil prices are probably going to be capped, not rise beyond $60. And we saw that after a period when they were rising again, they are falling. And then they say pay commission is going to create excess demand. But if you have this kind of framework, then excess demand is a good thing. You have underutilized capacity in industry. So how is it a problem? Then they're worried about foreign risks. when this communication took place and they shifted to neutral from accommodative, they said outflows, the US Fed is going to raise rates. But we are seeing that internationally, the India story has so much more credence these days. We're seeing too much of inflows coming in, the exchange rate appreciating, which also tends to reduce inflation and reduces demand because it hurts exports. So it's, the point is that, and there's a fear of foreign shocks, and the role of policy is to smooth these shocks. And the structural improvements, structural reforms we've seen have reduced macroeconomic vulnerabilities. So and we also have experience that we have a number of policies available to smooth shocks. So there's no need to be, and I think a lot of the fiscal consolidation as well as inflation targeting has been driven by international view of what an emerging market should do. And you have a fear that if you don't follow this, then capital flows will go out. Like we see in the rating agencies, they want fiscal deficits, debt to come down. When Indian debt is 60%, or while US has 150 or something percent of GDP. But so there's a lot of discussion these days about how rating agencies are biased. But the point is that we have to have confidence and tailor our policy to our domestic cycle and our needs, and believe that we can smooth these shocks and we can convince them, because the way markets are pricing in higher growth, if we have a framework, we can communicate and say, this is the framework which is driving, and this is why we need type 2 policy. I think you will be able to convince those people. You should have a counter argument to the argument which says that you need inflation targeting and you need fiscal deficits and public debt compression. So the problem is type 1 policy sees demand as affecting only inflation, while supply affects growth, while type 2 says you need to look more carefully at the interaction between the two and identify which are the shocks and what is the policy required. And you should be able to smooth it. And the costs of following type 1 policy for us are really, the last graph I will show, this falling credit growth, negative growth in investment, in industry, continuing excess capacity, NPAs that were small, focused in a few banks, focused in a few industrial sectors. Because the high interest rate regime, they've grown, they've become big, they've not been resolved, and now they are a drag on the economy. So we need to, type 1 people who push for structural reform and type 1 policy often argue that pain today leads to a better future. It's required for a better future. Squeeze out the waste from the economy, do the necessary reforms. But we need to ask ourselves if the pain has been excessive and perhaps hurt both the present and the future. Thank you.